Hello everyone and welcome to this video tutorial aimed at A-level students who are studying the Aspects of Comedy course for their English Literature qualification. I'm going to be using two texts to show you potentially how you might approach the Section C comedy task, in which students have one task about comedy just generally really, in which they have to talk about two texts that they have studied. So in this situation, in this example, I'm showing you how you might want to answer past questions that have come up before using The Importance of Being Earnest and some of the poems from the comedy anthology. So even though this is an essay which includes two texts, you don't have to compare those texts together. So there is no requirement to make comparisons here. You are literally making sure that you are answering the question that you are given and that you are talking about two texts. And those are the two most important things you've got to remember to do for the Section C task for Paper 1. So the three questions that I am working with today have already come up in recent years. We're going to be talking about happiness, journeys, and also marriage. So these are three examples of questions that have come up over the last 4 years or so. So the reason, and I've done this for many other texts as well, the reason I use these grids is because it helps students to organise their ideas, and it also helps them think about how they're going to engage with the text. And it's, I think, far better to talk about specific moments in the text rather than roam around the text in a kind of general way. So with English, the most important thing, the golden rule with AQA Lit B, is to make sure that you answer the question. I cannot stress that enough. So everything you say in these boxes, and these boxes, by the way, represent 3 paragraphs, everything you say has to be to do with that happiness word, because that is what you're being asked to talk about. And if there's a sense that you're kind of veering off that focus, they're going to start to take marks away from you. And I use the analogy of driving a car in a straight line. The best thing you can do when you're driving is make sure that the car stays thoroughly, in your lane. And as soon as your car begins to veer towards the edge of the road or the white lines, that's when your driving test, for example, becomes less successful. So your essay is the same. You must make sure that for the whole essay, you remain thoroughly focused on the task at hand. So if you do study Earnest, what could you say? So one of the things you can say in terms of happiness is Jack's happiness at the end of the play. So in a comedy, we may know that the resolution is often happy, and Jack really has 3 revelations at the end to do with the truth, which might make him feel very happy indeed. So he finds out that he really is called Ernest. He finds out that he really does have a brother, and he now, of course, knows that he can marry Gwendolyn. So those big question marks that we've had throughout the whole play have been answered relatively quickly at the end of the play. And they're all positive answers, meaning that he is going to perhaps achieve the happiness that he's always wanted in the pursuit of Gwendolyn. And of course, comedy is all about pursuing a love interest. So rather than lies and deceit being the focus of the ending, we actually get to the truth of the matter. And Miss Prism have had the information all along in terms of the manuscript and the handbag idea all along. But he has effectively transformed into his fictional creation. In other words, he no longer needs to lie that he has a brother called Ernest, because he is Ernest. And that's a pun, of course, because he spent the whole play being relatively dishonest. And Earnest with the A means honest or respectable. In terms of settings, and you must always think about settings in terms of comedies, the Manor House is therefore representative of a happy ending. It's where the characters end up, and it's where they all embrace at the end. So you could say that country setting is indicative of the happy ending that they have. And the happy ending, of course, is very much to do with the levels of happiness that they feel. All of the people, bar Lady Bracknell, all of the characters have a happy ending because they achieve their chosen love interest, even Miss Prism and Chasuble. The second paragraph, you might want to switch over to the poetry anthology at this point and talk about the happiness that Tam O'Shanter has when he is in the pub but also potentially the happiness that the witches and the other fantastical beings have in Kirkalloway during their party. So Tam in comedy is representative of the fool character and also of the uncultivated behaviour of the lower social classes. We might also see him as a lovable rogue, and he, from our perspective, from the reader's perspective, is also subject to a high degree of ridicule, and comedy tends to be about ridiculing characters. Parties are also very common in comedy because they create togetherness and that sense of happiness. So the rhythm and the rhyme as well in this poem, when that party is being described in the middle of the poem, as he and his horse peer into Kirkalloway, reinforce the growing sense of tension that is building, but also how the mirth and the merriment is getting gradually out of control. And the dancing is getting more and more erratic and the music louder and faster being played, for example. So the rhythm and rhyme there is also a method by which the sense of carousing and merriment is reinforced. So Tam is very happy. He survives, and there are moments in that poem when he is happy with his alcohol and with his drinking. And of course, we've got to remember that comedy tends to be about ordinary people that you would find in the street. So relatively common characters rather than characters of any status. For the final paragraph in this essay, you might want to turn back to Earnest and talk about the concept of bumbering as an escape, and that escape is creating that happiness, otherwise they wouldn't do it. So bumbering in the play is a device by which characters escape their societal obligations. Algy escapes the town and his obligations to Aunt Augusta, aka Lady Bracknell, for example, but Jack also escapes the country and his obligations to Cecily. So all of these characters, well, particularly these two, are both looking for ways to escape their obligations and to seek happiness. And if that means that they have to create a mask and disguise and deceive and masquerade as something else, or using something else to masquerade and change geographical location, then so be it. It's kind of worth it. So the deceit that these characters create causes complications which we as a audience would enjoy watching. For example, when Algy goes bumbering in Act 2 and Jack turns up in black at the manor house, we enjoy watching that scene because of it. It's a very farcical, relatively absurd situation, but it's of their own doing. It hasn't happened by accident. Algy has deliberately complicated things which then we enjoy watching as an audience. So those are three examples maybe of how you would want to structure your paragraphs in answer to the question of happiness. Again, you don't have to do three. I'm just doing three because I can fit that into my screen. You might want to do four, you might want to do two, but the two things you've got to remember is answer the question and also talk about both texts. The second task is about journeys, which came up recently. And very similar to the previous example for Ernest, the journey that you might want to talk about or discuss is Jack's journey to his happiness at the end. So that metaphorical journey. So at the start of the play, he doesn't know who he is. He's labelled as social indiscretion. He's also labelled a parcel by Lady Bracknell. And he also is defeated and heartbroken because he can't be with Gwendolen, while the big question mark about his heritage and past is not made clear. But by the end of the play, he finds out the truth. As already said, he really is Ernest, he really has a brother, and he can now marry Gwendolen. So he finishes the play in a very different place than when he started. And therefore, this is a character that has undergone a journey to happiness and has undergone, a journey and a change in fortune for the better. And he says, finally, he's learned the vital importance of being earnest, meaning now he is earnest, as in the proper noun. He now understands the importance of being called that. Again, very similar to the previous example, Tam O'Shanter, despite Tam O'Shanter's length and also the challenge that that poem might pose to do with the dialect in that poem, it is quite good in a number of these past questions for section C. Here we have literal journeys as Tam navigates his way through the poem between the market, the pub, the church, and the bridge. And those four settings, as well as the setting, I suppose, of Scotland and the town of Ayr more broadly, really goes to the heart of this poem. It has a very strong Scottish identity. As already said, Tam reminds us that comedy is often about the uncultivated behaviour of the lower social classes, the drinking, the roguish behaviour, the unscrupulous behaviour, the subject of ridicule that he is, as well as reminding us that comedy tends to be about ordinary people without status. So these literal journeys, whether that be on horseback or on foot, really coincides with the shape of the narrative, because remember, this is a narrative poem. And you might want to zoom in to the section where he has to leave the pub because it's closing time, by which point he's pretty intoxicated, and the storm is growing outside, which could be a metaphorical representation of his wife's Kate's anger and wrath, because he has effectively dismissed her view, which clearly has logic to it, which is if he isn't careful, he's going to do himself an injury or do himself in, which almost happens. And again, this reminds us that he is to blame. Tam O'Shanter is to blame for this problem. He is not being very sensible. He's drinking to the point where he actually endangers himself. He is to blame. And we laugh at him for causing this situation with the chase, for example. And perhaps you might want to argue that as well as a literal journey, there is a journey to enlightenment at the end, in terms of he will learn from this escapade. Maybe not. Maybe he's not enlightened enough. But because the speaker turns to the reader at the end and says, remember Tam O'Shanter's mare, meaning remember this story if you ever want to drink a lot, you might say, well, Tam has learned a lesson from this and he might avoid this kind of behaviour in the future. However, he might not be enlightened enough to do so, and he's going to repeat the same mistake again. So in Tam, there's a literal journey there between locations, but also his journey maybe to a better position of knowledge. Finally, you might want to turn your attention back to Ernest again and go to Algy's journey back to the manor house where he masquerades as Ernest. Really good scene in terms of staging to analyse and how we are ridiculing and seeking delight and humour from characters that get themselves into these silly, far-fetched situations. So this is another literal journey from the town to the country as part of his Bunburying agenda. And because of the different locations, nobody knows him in the country, for example, it means that he can get away with it because nobody recognises him. And that's very entertaining for an audience to watch, particularly when Jack appears in black, which complicates matters because he doesn't know that Ernest allegedly is on the porch, who he has just said has died of a severe chill in Paris. So there's that degree of roguish, opportunistic and unscrupulous behaviour on Algy's part that he's called a scoundrel as well by Jack in that scene as well. So you could also talk about Algy's journey from town to country as part of his Bunburying agenda in Act 2. The final question is marriage, and if I got £1 for every time I mentioned marriage or relationships or the pursuit of a love interest for comedy, I would be very rich indeed, because that's exactly what is happening in this question. I'm going to start this time with the poetry and talk about Mrs. Sisyphus. Now, in this case, marriage does not always have to be happy, and we know that because of poems like Mrs. Sisyphus, which actually depicts a dysfunctional and kind of unrewarding depiction of marriage. This is not like Ernest, which would have you believe that all the couples are very happy at the end. This is the opposite. So it actually sets up a nice debate for this question. Effectively, this poem is a rant or a diatribe that Mrs. Sisyphus is engaging in, where she's saying that her husband is so foolish because he doesn't realise the futility of his work and his endeavours, and that links to this modern concept of being a workaholic. The word workaholic, by the way, entered the English language in the 1960s, so it's not perhaps as modern as we think. So a 20th century phenomenon for sure. So marriage is not rewarding or blissful here. There's lots of colloquial language that shows how sarcastic and mocking she is of him. There's no sense of happy resolution. This kind of bitterness that she feels with her twisted smirk is probably going to be the case forever, as he continues with his work by pushing Miss Boulder up the hill. So marriage here does not come off in a very good way. It's actually far more bitter and unrewarding than perhaps Ernest would be. The second poem, if we want to do two poems for this question, would be My Rival's House. And the reason why you could use this to talk about marriage is because of the fact that the mother-in-law is only in the speaker's life because the speaker wants to marry or has married the mother-in-law's son. So this is the line, never can escape scot-free, the sour potluck of family, meaning sometimes you're lucky with your in-laws and sometimes you're not. And in this case, it seems she hasn't been very lucky at all. So the marriage has brought her in contact with the comic villain, the mother-in-law, and that is a great source of bitterness and resentment and unease. The house is key for this poem because you need the characters to occupy the same time and place in order for that resentment and fractured relationship to be felt. So the house is really a metaphor for this disconnect between these two women. You have the cushions that are too uncomfortable to sit on. You've got the bitter cup of tea, which doesn't taste very nice. You have walking on tiptoes, taking your shoes off, scratches in the table. So this house really metaphorically represents the disconnect and the fractured relationship between these two women. The mocking tone of Queen Bee and Lady of the House is the speaker really admitting that in this house, the mother-in-law has the power because this is her domain. It is not the domain of the speaker, who is the invitee and the outsider to the house, but also perhaps the family as well. And there's also in this poem a semantic field to do with rivalry and fighting. Lots of words such as fight, foul, survival, rival, etc., which really goes to the heart of this feeling of disconnect that the speaker has. Now, you could argue that the speaker is feeling is being a bit over the top, a bit hyperbolic maybe. She's catastrophizing perhaps. But it's a stream of consciousness, so she's uninterrupted. So we really understand as a reader how she's feeling in this situation. She's trying to create the mask of manners and be polite. But that's actually ended up being very restrictive as she cannot feel herself. She's putting on a polite front, and that is hiding her true feelings of bitterness. In order to meet the requirements of the mark scheme and the question, you have to now, of course, talk about Ernest if you're going to keep to the 3-paragraph idea. And very similar to what we've already discussed in this video, the idea that marriage is often the central focus of the characters and their pursuit of that love interest. So particularly Jack and Algy, they have their ideal woman in mind. And the marriage at the end is part of that happy resolution. So comedy tends to be about the journey or the pursuit of love interest rather than the state of being married itself. And the whole of Ernest charts how Jack and Algy approach and achieve the women of their choice rather than actually the state of them already being married. Jack's interrogation by Lady Bracknell is caused because he has shown interest in her daughter. So you could also analyse that scene and how uncomfortable he feels and talk about Lady Bracknell being the embodiment of the comic villain. And finally, you could also talk about Algy bumbling in Act 2. He's bumbling because he wants to woo Cecily and meet her because he's interested romantically in her. So bumbling is part of him wanting to see the female of his choice. And that brings into question information about deception and masquerading and disequilibrium and disguise and all of these kind of things that we associate a lot with comedy as well as transformation. So those are 3 questions that have come up in the past for Paper 1 Section C for A-Level. This is English Literature B. And I've used 2 texts, the Comedy Anthology and Earnest, as a way to perhaps approach these questions and think about the kind of content that you might want to include. You don't have to include 3 paragraphs. The most important 2 things is to answer the question set and not veer off, and also talk about both texts in some way or another as shown here. So hopefully that was useful, and thank you very much for watching.